March 15, 1945. A small diner in rural Tennessee sat beneath a gray afternoon sky, its windows fogged with steam from the kitchen. Inside, 7 young men in faded uniforms laughed over plates of fried chicken and mashed potatoes, their German accents mixing with the clink of silverware against ceramic. They had no idea that the meal they were enjoying, the first decent food some had tasted in months, would become the catalyst for a moment that would challenge everything they thought they understood about the country holding them captive. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these prisoners of conflict were about to witness would shatter their assumptions about American society and transform their understanding of the very nation they had been taught to view as their enemy. The irony was almost unbearable. They, the captured enemy, sat warm and well-fed while American soldiers who had fought for this country's freedom were turned away at the door. The journey to that diner had begun 6 weeks earlier, when Friedrich Weber, a 23-year-old former corporal in the German armed forces during the conflict, had arrived at Camp Forest, Tennessee, along with 247 other prisoners. The camp, sprawling across nearly 75,000 acres, housed more than 12,000 prisoners by early 1945. Friedrich remembered the train ride from the port, staring through barred windows at a landscape so vast and untouched by conflict that it seemed impossible such abundance could exist in a world at arms. The American countryside had stunned him. Mile after mile of farmland, forests untouched by artillery, bridges standing intact, towns with lights burning freely at night. In the Europe he had left behind, landscapes bore the scars of years of fighting, cratered fields, burned villages, populations scattered. Here, life continued as if the global struggle was something happening on another planet entirely. The camp itself had shocked them all. Friedrich had expected barbed wire and guard towers, and those were certainly present. But he had not expected 3 meals a day with portions that exceeded what he had eaten even before being deployed. He had not expected access to a library with more than 2,000 books. He had not expected recreational facilities, or the opportunity to work for wages, or the Geneva Convention guidelines posted in German on every barrack wall. The first meal at camp had been surreal. Breakfast had included eggs, bacon, bread with butter, coffee with real sugar and fruit. Friedrich had stared at the tray, unable to comprehend it. This was enemy food, food provided by captors to their prisoners. In his last months in uniform, he had subsisted on increasingly sparse rations, black bread that was more sawdust than flour, thin soup, occasional scraps of meat that might have once been part of an animal. Klaus Hartmann, a former mechanic from Stuttgart, had been captured in France the previous autumn. At 31, he was one of the older prisoners in their barrack, a quiet man with calloused hands and a thoughtful manner. On their 3rd night in camp, he had pulled Friedrich aside. "Do not trust the kindness," Klaus had said, his voice low. "This is strategy. They fatten us to make us compliant, to break our will." But as weeks became months, that explanation grew harder to maintain. The Americans were not kind in the way an interrogator might be kind, searching for information. They were bureaucratically correct, following regulations with the same mechanical precision that governed everything in this enormous country. The guards were neither cruel nor particularly friendly. They were simply doing a job, and that job included ensuring prisoners received treatment specified by international agreements. The contrast with stories Friedrich had heard from earlier in the conflict was stark. Men who had been captured by the Soviets told different tales, of starvation, of forced labor in conditions that guaranteed death, of summary executions. The Western Allies, particularly the Americans, operated under a different set of rules entirely. They documented everything, followed procedures, maintained standards even when it must have seemed wasteful or excessive. Friedrich worked in the camp vegetable gardens alongside a rotation of other prisoners. The American sergeant who supervised them, a middle-aged man named Patterson from somewhere called Iowa, treated the work with the seriousness of a military operation. He expected efficiency and effort, but he also ensured regular water breaks and that no one worked through the midday heat of the southern summer that had preceded the current mild spring weather. "Your tomatoes are looking good," Patterson had said one afternoon in late February, walking the rows with Friedrich. "You know plants." "My father had a small farm," Friedrich had replied carefully, still uncertain about engaging in casual conversation with his captors. "Before the economic troubles." Patterson had nodded. "Same story everywhere, I suppose. My dad lost our farm in '32. Dust Bowl got what the Depression didn't." It was such a strange conversation to have with an enemy. Friedrich had been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, obsessed with material wealth and individual pleasure at the expense of national strength. Yet here was a man whose family had lost everything, who had nevertheless ended up in uniform, tending gardens for prisoners while his own countrymen fought across the Pacific and in the final pushes through Europe. The work program allowed prisoners to earn 80 cents a day in camp scrip, which could be spent at the canteen for toiletries, cigarettes, or candy. It was a fortune compared to the nothing they would have had otherwise. Some prisoners saved their scrip for months. Others, like Ernst Becker, a former student from Berlin, spent it as quickly as they earned it. "Why save?" Ernst had argued one evening, lying on his bunk with a candy bar. "We are prisoners. Tomorrow is uncertain. Today I have chocolate that tastes like it came from Switzerland. Today is enough." Ernst was 19, the youngest in their barrack, and he possessed a resilience that sometimes seemed like denial. He had been captured during his first engagement, barely 3 weeks after arriving at the front. He told jokes, played cards, and refused to discuss anything that had happened before his capture. Friedrich suspected there were memories Ernst was deliberately not examining. The youngest prisoner carried a photograph he never showed anyone, but kept tucked into the frame of his bunk. Friedrich had glimpsed it once, a woman who might have been a mother or sister, standing in front of a building that might no longer exist. Ernst would look at it sometimes in the evening, when he thought no one was watching, his young face older than 19 in those moments. The seventh man who would eventually sit in that Tennessee diner was Otto Kraus, a former teacher from Hamburg. At 42, Otto was old enough to be father to several of the younger prisoners. He had taught literature before being conscripted, and he spent his evenings in camp reading everything the library offered, trying to understand this strange country through its books. "Listen to this," Otto had said one evening, reading aloud from a copy of Steinbeck. "The whole story is about poverty, about workers treated as disposable. This was published here in America just a few years before the conflict. They criticize themselves openly, print it in books, discuss it freely. Propaganda," Klaus had muttered, showing problems to distract from worse truths. But Otto had shaken his head. "I do not think so. I think it is stranger than that. I think they actually believe in arguing with themselves." Otto had been reading voraciously, consuming American literature like a man trying to decode a cipher. Mark Twain, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, Sinclair Lewis. Books that criticized American society, that questioned American values, that depicted poverty and injustice and failure, and all of it available in a prison camp library, translated into German, provided by the very government being criticized. "This is what I cannot understand," Otto had said during one of their evening discussions. "At home we had lists of forbidden books, approved texts, censored newspapers. Here, in a prison camp, I have access to books that accuse America of betraying its own principles. What kind of enemy allows its prisoners to read its own self-criticisms? Perhaps they are confident enough not to fear criticism," Friedrich had suggested. Or perhaps, Klaus had countered, they are so fractured internally that they cannot maintain consistent control even of their prison camps. But that explanation satisfied no one. The camp was not chaotic. It was meticulously organized, efficiently run, abundantly supplied. Every aspect of it spoke to a nation with resources to spare, systems that functioned, institutions that maintained their integrity even under the stress of global conflict. The opportunity to visit the diner had come through a work program expansion. Local farms, desperately short of labor with so many men serving overseas, had petitioned to use prisoner work details. The army had agreed, under strict supervision. Groups of 7 to 10 prisoners would be transported to farms, where they would work for wages that went partly to the prisoners and partly to offset the cost of their maintenance. The arrangement benefited everyone. Farmers got desperately needed labor. Prisoners earned money and broke the monotony of camp life. The army demonstrated its commitment to following international law regarding prisoner treatment. It was a very American solution, pragmatic, contractual, mutually beneficial. On March 15th, a group including Friedrich, Klaus, Ernst, Otto, and 3 others had finished a morning repairing fences on a cattle farm 12 miles from camp. The work had been honest labor, the kind that left muscles pleasantly tired and hands slightly scraped. The farmer, Henderson, had inspected their work with approval, nodding at the straight lines and tight wire. Corporal Jackson, their guard for the day, was a lanky man from Georgia with an easy manner and a wedding ring. He twisted when he was thinking. He had watched the prisoners work with the relaxed attention of someone confident in his authority, but not particularly worried about being tested. "Y'all worked hard," Jackson had said as they loaded tools back into the truck. "Farmers pleased. We got time before we need to be back. There's a diner up the road makes the best fried chicken in 3 counties. My treat if you want." The prisoners had exchanged glances. This seemed irregular, possibly a test, but Jackson's offer appeared genuine, and the alternative was returning to camp early to sit in the barracks. The camp food was adequate, even generous by prisoner standards, but it was institutional, prepared in massive quantities. The promise of restaurant food, prepared fresh, was tempting. "Is this permitted?" Friedrich had asked carefully. Jackson had shrugged. "Regulations say I'm responsible for your security and welfare while you're off camp. Welfare includes feeding you proper. Diners closer than camp. Makes sense to me." The logic was very American, finding justification within rules for what one wanted to do anyway. They had agreed. The drive to the diner took them through countryside that looked like something from a painting. Rolling hills, neat farmhouses, cattle grazing in fields still green despite the season. Friedrich watched it all with a sense of displacement. This was the enemy homeland, the nation they had been fighting against, yet it looked more peaceful and prosperous than anywhere he had seen in Europe for years. The diner was called Mabel's, a single-story building with white clapboard siding and a hand-painted sign. 4 trucks sat in the gravel parking area. Through the windows they could see perhaps a dozen people at tables and along a counter. Smoke rose from a chimney, carrying the smell of cooking food that made Friedrich's stomach tighten with anticipation. "Now these are farm folks," Jackson had said as they climbed out of the truck. "They're going to be curious about you. Just be polite, don't cause any fuss, and we'll be fine." They had filed in. 7 prisoners in their clearly marked uniforms with PW stenciled on the backs, followed by Jackson in his American uniform with his rifle slung over his shoulder. The diner had gone quiet for perhaps 5 seconds, every head turning, every conversation stopping, and then resumed as if nothing unusual had occurred. The interior was warm, almost too warm after the cool March air outside. The smell of frying food was overwhelming: chicken, onions, coffee, pie. A radio played quietly in the corner. Some news program Friedrich could not quite make out. The floor was worn linoleum, the counter was formica, the stools were covered in red vinyl with duct tape patches. A woman Friedrich assumed was Mabel, somewhere in her 50s with her hair in a practical bun, had approached with menus. She wore an apron stained with the day's work and an expression of practiced hospitality. "Afternoon, Corporal," she had said to Jackson. "These fellas working the Henderson farm?" "Yes, ma'am. Thought we'd get some lunch before heading back." "Well, you've come to the right place. Take that big table in the back, I'll get you all set up." And just like that, they had been seated. The menus listed items for prices that seemed impossibly low, even accounting for their limited understanding of American currency. Fried chicken, roast beef, pork chops, 5 different kinds of pie. The portions were described in terms that suggested abundance: heap of mashed potatoes and generous sliced on full plate. "Order what you like," Jackson had said. "Nothing too crazy, but get yourselves a proper meal." When the food had arrived, Friedrich had stared at his plate in genuine disbelief. 2 pieces of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, a biscuit with butter, and a slice of apple pie waiting on the counter for after. It was more food than he had seen on a single plate since before the conflict, possibly since before the economic troubles of the 30s. The chicken was hot, crispy, seasoned with salt and pepper, and something else he could not identify. The potatoes were creamy and rich with butter. The gravy was thick and savory. The green beans had been cooked with bacon. Even the biscuit was perfect, flaky and soft and still warm. Klaus had picked up a piece of chicken carefully, as if it might vanish if he moved too quickly. Ernst had simply started eating, making small sounds of pleasure that would have been embarrassing under other circumstances. Otto had bowed his head for a moment, not in prayer exactly, but in some private acknowledgement of the strangeness of the moment. Around them, the other diners had returned to their meals and conversations. A farmer at the counter was discussing crop rotation with Mabel. Two women at a table near the window were looking at a catalogue, planning some purchase. An older man in the corner was reading a newspaper, occasionally shaking his head at whatever he was reading. It was all so aggressively normal. Here were enemy prisoners, identifiable by their uniforms, eating lunch in a civilian establishment, and no one seemed to find it particularly remarkable. Friedrich had expected hostility, or at least cold curiosity. Instead, he found indifference, as if the presence of enemy combatants was just another aspect of wartime routine. They had been eating for perhaps 10 minutes, the initial desperate hunger giving way to slower appreciation, when the door had opened and 3 men in American uniforms had walked in. Friedrich had noticed them peripherally, still focused on his meal. He had noticed Mabel approaching them. He had noticed her voice, though not her words, had taken on a different tone, not hostile exactly, but firm in a way it had not been with the prisoners. Then he had noticed the silence spreading through the diner like ripples in water, conversations stopping mid-sentence, forks pausing halfway to mouths. He had looked up and finally understood what he was seeing. The 3 soldiers were wearing the same uniform as Jackson, the same uniform as the American guards at camp, the same uniform as every American soldier Friedrich had encountered. But their skin was dark, the deep brown that meant they were Negroes, members of the race he had been taught occupied the lowest rungs of American society. The soldiers stood just inside the door, their caps in their hands, their postures carefully neutral. They were clean, pressed, properly uniformed. The oldest carried sergeant stripes on his sleeve. The youngest could not have been more than 20. They stood with the bearing of men who knew what was about to happen and were steeling themselves for it. "I'm sorry," Mabel was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the silent room. "We don't serve colored here. There's a place in town that will help you." The words hung in the air like something physical. Friedrich felt the chicken in his mouth turn to ash. Across the table he saw Otto's fork freeze, saw Ernst's eyes widen, saw Klaus's face harden into an expression Friedrich could not immediately interpret. One of the soldiers, the oldest of the 3 with sergeant stripes on his sleeve, had responded with a voice carefully empty of emotion. "We're stationed at Camp Forest, ma'am. Just looking for a meal before we have to report." "I understand, but it's our policy. I don't make the rules." The sergeant had nodded, a gesture that somehow contained both acceptance and profound weariness. "Yes, ma'am, we understand." Friedrich watched the exchange with a growing sense of unreality. These were American soldiers. They wore the uniform of the nation currently defeating Germany, the nation that had landed forces in France, that had pushed through Italy, that was now driving toward the heart of German territory. They had fought for this country, possibly had been wounded for it, certainly had risked everything for it, and they were being turned away from a diner while 7 enemy prisoners sat eating fried chicken. The 3 soldiers had stood there for a moment longer, a moment that stretched with humiliation and anger carefully contained. The youngest soldier's jaw was tight, his hands clenched around his cap. The sergeant maintained his neutral expression, but Friedrich could see the cost of that neutrality in the tightness around his eyes. Then the sergeant had nodded once, said something quiet to his companions, and they had turned toward the door. As they turned, the sergeant's eyes had swept the room and had landed on Friedrich's table. On 7 men in prisoner uniforms with PW visible on their backs and fronts, eating fried chicken and drinking sweet tea. On Corporal Jackson, white-skinned, sitting comfortably among enemy prisoners. Their eyes had met, the American sergeant's and Friedrich's, for perhaps 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Friedrich had seen the man perform the same calculation Friedrich was performing, adding up the absurdity, the mathematical impossibility of the equation before them. Enemy prisoners welcomed. American soldiers turned away. The only variable in the equation was skin color. Then the soldiers had left, the door closing behind them with a small bell's cheerful jingle that seemed obscene in its normalcy. The diner had remained silent for perhaps 10 more seconds. Then, like a machine restarting, conversations resumed, forks clinked against plates. The radio continued its broadcast about events in distant places. But at the table of prisoners, no one moved. Friedrich looked down at his plate, at the half-eaten chicken and the potatoes growing cold, and suddenly it had tasted like shame. Across the table he could see the same realization moving across his companions' faces, like a shadow. Klaus spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. Those were American soldiers who fought against us. They were, Jackson said quietly. His face was unreadable, his hands flat on the table, no longer eating. And they were turned away, Otto said, while we, the prisoners, the enemy, are served without question. Ernst was staring at the door where the soldiers had exited, his young face struggling with something he had no framework to process. This makes no sense, he said finally. We were told America was weak because it was mixed, because it had no racial unity. But you enforce the divisions yourselves, you make them into rules. Mabel had returned to their table, her order pad ready, her expression unchanged by what had just transpired. "If we all need anything else?" The question hung in the air. Friedrich found himself looking at this woman who had been nothing but courteous to them, who had smiled and called them honey when taking their orders, who had treated them with more warmth than she had shown those 3 soldiers. "Ma'am," Otto said slowly in his careful English, "those soldiers, they fight for your country, yes." Mabel's expression had tightened slightly. "That's not really your concern, is it?" "No," Otto agreed, "but I am trying to understand. We are prisoners. We fought against America. But we are welcomed here. They fought for America, but they are not. This is confusing to me. Like I said, I don't make the rules. That's just how things are done around here." "Who does make the rules?" Ernst asked, his young voice sharp with something that might have been anger or might have been genuine confusion. Jackson had cleared his throat. "That's enough. Finish your meals." But Friedrich could not finish. None of them could. They had sat there with plates still half full. Food they would have treasured an hour ago now impossible to swallow, while the other diners gradually resumed their conversations, and Mabel moved on to other tables as if nothing significant had occurred. The farmer at the counter was still discussing crop rotation. The 2 women at the window were still looking at their catalogue. The old man was still reading his newspaper. Life continued, normal and unchanged, around a moment that had shattered something fundamental in Friedrich's understanding of the world. In the truck on the way back to camp, no one spoke for the first several miles. Jackson drove with his eyes fixed on the road, his jaw working as if chewing words he would not say aloud. The prisoners sat in the back, each alone with thoughts too large and complicated to easily articulate. Finally, Klaus broke the silence. "Is it always like this, in America?" Jackson was quiet for so long Friedrich thought he might not answer. Then, "In a lot of places, yes, not everywhere. But yeah, in a lot of places." "But these soldiers," Friedrich said, "they serve in your military, they fight in the same conflict." "In segregated units," Jackson said. "They serve, but separately. Different units, different facilities, different everything." "This makes no sense," Ernst said flatly. "We were told America is weak because it is mixed, because it has no unity of race and purpose. But you create division deliberately? You enforce it with rules?" Jackson's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Look, I don't claim to understand it all myself. I grew up in Georgia. This is how things have always been where I'm from. You learn not to think about it too much." "But you must think about it," Otto pressed. "You must see the contradiction. You fight against us, against Germany, because of beliefs about race and superiority." "Yes, this is what we are told, that America opposes the German ideology. But then you have your own rules about race, your own separations." "It's not the same thing, Jackson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "How is it different?" Klaus asked. Jackson did not answer. The truck continued down the road, passing through countryside that looked idyllic and peaceful, hiding beneath its beauty the same human contradictions that existed everywhere. Back at camp, The 7 men had gone to their barracks in silence. That evening, the story spread through the prisoner population like fire through dry grass. Some dismissed it as American hypocrisy, confirmation of everything they had been taught about the corruption and weakness of democratic societies. But others, like Friedrich, found themselves unable to dismiss it so easily. He lay on his bunk that night staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what he had seen. The America that fed its prisoners well and treated them according to international law. The America that produced more steel, more vehicles, more aircraft than any nation in history. The America that had printed books criticizing its own government. The America that turned away its own soldiers from a diner while welcoming the enemy. None of it fit together into a coherent picture. Each fact contradicted another fact. The nation was powerful but divided, confident but insecure, principled but hypocritical. It defeated enemies abroad while maintaining injustice at home. It followed rules meticulously in some contexts while violating basic human dignity in others. Otto climbed down from the bunk above and sat on the edge of Friedrich's bed. "You are thinking about today." "Yes. So am I. I keep seeing that sergeant's face, the way he looked at us. He understood what we were seeing," Friedrich said. "He knew what we were thinking." "And what are we thinking?" Friedrich was quiet for a moment. "That we were taught many things about America before we came here as prisoners. We were taught that democracy makes a nation weak. We were taught that mixing of races creates chaos and inefficiency. We were taught that individual freedom means selfishness and lack of unity." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Then we arrive here, and we find that we are treated according to international law, given food and shelter and work. We find a nation that has produced weapons and supplies in quantities we can barely comprehend. We find people who argue openly about their government, who print criticisms in newspapers, who disagree violently about important questions, and yet somehow this nation functions, even thrives. But they still have these rules," Otto said, "these separations. Yes, which means either we were taught wrong about what creates strength, or they are not as weak as their divisions should make them. Perhaps both." Ernst had been listening from his own bunk. "Or perhaps," he said quietly, "we were lied to about many things." The words hung in the darkness. To acknowledge that possibility was to open a door that could not be easily closed. If they had been lied to about America's weakness, what else had been lies? The necessity of the conflict, the righteousness of their cause, the superiority of their system? These were dangerous thoughts, thoughts that could unravel everything they had believed, everything they had been willing to risk their lives for. But they were also thoughts that, once begun, could not be stopped. In the following days, the incident at the diner became a topic of quiet discussion among the prisoners. Some sought to maintain their previous beliefs, arguing that American hypocrisy proved the superiority of German principles of racial unity. But others found this argument increasingly hollow. "If our principles were superior," Klaus said during one of these discussions, "why did we lose? Why are we here in a camp, well-fed and well-treated, while our cities are being reduced to rubble?" Superior ideas should produce superior results. The Americans simply had more resources, someone argued. "But why did they have more resources?" Otto countered. "They are a younger nation, with the same access to technology, the same opportunity to industrialize. Yet they built more, produced more, organized better. If our system was superior, should we not have been more efficient, more productive?" The debates continued, prisoners wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Some clung to familiar certainties. Others began the painful process of reconsidering everything they had believed, and a few, like Friedrich, found themselves suspended between old certainties and new doubts, unable to fully embrace either. 3 weeks after the diner incident, Friedrich was working in the garden when Corporal Patterson approached him with unusual formality. "Weber, I need to speak with you." Friedrich had straightened, immediately alert. Formal conversations with guards rarely brought good news. "There's been a request," Patterson said, "from Corporal Jackson. He wants you and the others who were at that diner to participate in something. It's voluntary. You can refuse without any consequences." "What kind of participation?" "There's going to be a meeting. Some local church groups, some soldiers from camp, some community leaders. They want to discuss what happened at Mabel's. Jackson thinks it would be valuable for you all to be there, to share your perspective as outsiders who witnessed it. Friedrich had felt a chill of uncertainty. This sounds like politics. We are prisoners. We should not involve ourselves in American politics. Patterson had smiled slightly. That's a wise instinct, but this isn't exactly politics. It's more like conscience. People struggling with questions about right and wrong. Your presence might help them think about things differently. I do not understand how we could help. We are the enemy. Maybe that's exactly why you can help. You see things Americans have stopped seeing because they're too familiar. Friedrich had discussed it with the others that evening. Klaus had been immediately suspicious, seeing it as potential manipulation. Ernst had been curious, eager for any break from routine. Otto had been thoughtfully in favor. We have been given a strange gift, Otto had said. The gift of seeing this country from the outside, without the assumptions of those who grew up here. Perhaps we have something worth sharing, and perhaps, he added more quietly, we owe something to those 3 soldiers who were turned away while we ate. That last point had resonated. They had benefited from an injustice not of their making, but they had benefited nonetheless. If speaking about what they had seen could contribute to changing that injustice, perhaps they had an obligation to do so. In the end, all 7 had agreed to attend. The meeting was held in the basement of a Methodist church in a town whose name Friedrich never learned. Perhaps 30 people attended, a mixture of white civilians, a few white soldiers from camp and 5 Negro soldiers, including the sergeant from the diner. The basement was typical of such spaces: low ceiling, folding chairs arranged in rows, a small podium at the front, and a persistent smell of coffee and old hymnals. The walls were decorated with children's Sunday school artwork and inspirational posters with Bible verses. The sergeant's name was Robert Johnson, Friedrich learned. He was from Ohio, had been in uniform for 4 years, and had served in the Pacific before being reassigned to Camp Forest. When he saw the German prisoners enter, his expression had been carefully neutral, but Friedrich thought he detected a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or curiosity. The meeting had been awkward at first, no one quite certain how to begin. A minister named Reverend Thomas had opened with a prayer, then had spoken about the incident at Mabel's and how it had troubled some members of the community who had heard about it. Reverend Thomas was a thin man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle manner that somehow conveyed absolute moral certainty. He spoke with the cadence of someone accustomed to being heard, pausing for effect, letting his words settle before continuing. "We are here," Reverend Thomas had said, "because some of us are struggling with the contradiction we see. We read in our papers about fighting tyranny, about defending freedom, about the righteousness of our cause, but then we see how we treat our own citizens, our own soldiers, and we wonder if we have the right to claim righteousness." An older white man, a farmer named Henderson, whom Friedrich recognized from the work detail, had spoken next. "Now, Reverend, I respect what you're saying, but you're making this about something it's not. That diner has its rules. Private property means something. We can't force people to serve who they don't want to serve. Even when the people being refused service have fought for this country," asked a white woman Friedrich did not know. "Even when we're serving the people who fought against us." "That's different," Henderson had said, but he had sounded uncertain. "How is it different?" the woman had pressed. "Explain to me how it's different to serve enemy prisoners but turn away our own soldiers. I'd like to understand the logic." Henderson had shifted uncomfortably. "It's about maintaining order, about respecting how things have always been done. You start changing things, you don't know what you'll unleash." "Maybe what we'll unleash is justice," someone else said. The debate had continued, voices rising and falling, arguments familiar and predictable. Friedrich had listened with the attention of someone trying to understand a foreign language, catching some words but missing larger meanings. Sergeant Johnson had been asked to speak. He had stood slowly, a tall man with a presence that commanded attention even in silence. He wore his uniform correctly, his posture military straight, his hands relaxed at his sides. "I have been wearing this uniform for 4 years, he had said, his voice measured and calm. "I have served in New Guinea and the Philippines. I have watched men I trained with lose their lives in combat. When I returned to the States for reassignment, I expected things would be different than when I left. I expected that serving my country, bleeding for it, would mean something. He had paused, and in that pause Friedrich had heard years of disappointment, of hopes repeatedly raised and crushed, of dignity maintained in the face of relentless indignity. Instead, I find I can be turned away from a diner while prisoners of conflict are served without question. I find that the uniform I wear, the service I've given, matters less than the color of my skin. I find that the country I've fought for considers me less worthy of basic courtesy than men who fought against it. He had looked directly at Friedrich and the others. I hold no ill will toward these men. They did not make the rules at that diner. They did not create the system that values them above me. But their presence here, the fact that they are being asked to witness this conversation, shows us all the absurdity of what we accept as normal. The words had landed with weight. Several people were crying. Others looked angry or uncomfortable or lost in thought. Friedrich had felt the pressure of those words, the responsibility they implied. Then Reverend Thomas had asked Friedrich and the others to share their perspective. Otto had spoken first, his English careful but clear. We were taught many things about America before we came here as prisoners. We were taught that democracy makes a nation weak. We were taught that mixing of races creates chaos and inefficiency. We were taught that individual freedom means selfishness and lack of unity. He had paused, choosing his words carefully. Then we arrive here, and we find that we are treated according to international law, given food and shelter and work. We find a nation that has produced weapons and supplies in quantities we can barely comprehend. We find people who argue openly about their government, who print criticisms in newspapers, who disagree violently about important questions, and yet somehow this nation functions, even thrives. What does this have to do with what happened at the diner? Henderson had asked. Everything, Otto had replied, because what we were taught about American weakness was wrong. This nation is not weak. But then we see how you treat your own citizens based on the color of their skin, and we wonder if you understand your own strength. You divide yourselves deliberately. You enforce these divisions with rules and customs, and yet you still have enough strength to defeat us. He had paused, looking around the room. So I must ask, what could you accomplish if you stopped dividing yourselves? What could you build if you treated all your citizens with the dignity you show your prisoners? Klaus had spoken next, his voice rough with emotion. In the place I come from, we were told that we were superior because we were unified in race and purpose. We were told that purity of blood meant purity of national will. I believed this. I believed it absolutely. He had looked at Sergeant Johnson. Then I sit in a diner, eating food I do not deserve, while you and your companions are turned away. And I understand that we were told lies about many things, but we were also told some truths. Race does matter to people. Division based on race does create weakness. But we learned the wrong lesson about which divisions and which weaknesses. Klaus had paused, struggling with words in a language not his own, struggling with ideas that challenged everything he had believed. Your nation divides itself and yet remains strong. My nation promised unity and delivered ruin. Perhaps the question is not whether divisions exist, but whether they are enforced by law or overcome by principle. The room had been silent. Friedrich had seen tears on some faces, both white and Negro. Others looked angry or confused or thoughtful. The atmosphere had shifted, become charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Ernst, the youngest, had spoken last. I am 19 years old. I have no wisdom to share. But I know what I felt in that diner when those soldiers were turned away. I felt shame. Not because I am German, and not because we lost the conflict. I felt shame because I was being treated better than men who had fought for the country I was fighting against, simply because of how I look. His voice had cracked slightly, the emotion breaking through his usual cheerful facade. This shame is not political. It is human. And I think if more people felt this shame, things might change. I think if we could all see ourselves as we are, accepting kindness we do not deserve while denying it to those who have earned it, we might find it unbearable. Ernst had sat down, his young face flushed, his hands trembling slightly. In the silence that followed, Friedrich had heard someone sobbing quietly. the sound carrying in the church basement like a prayer or an accusation. The meeting had continued for another hour, but those words from the prisoners had created a shift in the room. Henderson, the farmer, had sat with his head in his hands, saying nothing more. Some of the white civilians had engaged in heated arguments with each other, debating property rights versus human dignity, tradition versus justice, order versus equality. Sergeant Johnson and the other Negro soldiers had remained largely quiet after their initial statements, listening with expressions that mixed hope with deep skepticism, born of long experience with promises that never quite materialized into change. As they were leaving, Sergeant Johnson had approached Friedrich directly. "Thank you," he had said simply. "I did nothing worth thanking," Friedrich had replied. "You told the truth as you saw it. That's worth something." Johnson had paused. "It's strange, isn't it? You and I were enemies 6 months ago. If we'd met in combat, we'd have tried to end each other. But here we are, and you're speaking up for me in a church basement." "This conflict has many strange ironies," Friedrich had agreed. "Can I ask you something?" Johnson had said. "When you go home after all this is over, what will you tell people about America?" Friedrich had thought carefully. "I will tell them it is more complicated than we were taught. I will tell them it is powerful in ways we did not understand. And I will tell them it is fighting itself as much as it fights its enemies." Johnson had nodded slowly. "That might be the most accurate description of this country I've ever heard." They had shaken hands. Enemy soldier and American soldier, prisoner and guard, divided by nationality and conflict, but connected by a shared moment of moral clarity in a Tennessee diner. In the months that followed, Friedrich and the others continued their work details, their garden tending, their quiet life as prisoners of conflict. The Americans continued their advance through Europe. News filtered into the camp through official channels and rumors. Cities falling, territory shrinking, the inevitable conclusion approaching. When the end came in May of 1945, Friedrich felt neither relief nor despair. He felt instead a strange numbness, a sense that the world he had known had already ended months or years ago, and this was merely the formality of acknowledging it. The prisoners at Camp Forest were not immediately repatriated. They remained for months, continuing their work programs, their routines, their slow adjustment to a reality without the structure of conflict. Friedrich continued to work in the gardens, watching vegetables grow through the summer, harvesting them in the fall, preparing the soil for winter. The work was meditative, allowing him time to think about everything that had happened, everything he had seen, everything he would need to process when he finally returned home. The garden became a place of reflection, the rhythm of planting and tending and harvesting a metaphor for larger processes of destruction and rebuilding. In October, Reverend Thomas visited the camp and asked to speak with Friedrich specifically. They met in a small office, Corporal Patterson present as required by regulations. "I wanted to tell you," Reverend Thomas said, "that the meeting we held in March has led to some changes. Not everything we hoped for, but some things. The Methodist Conference in our district passed a resolution condemning segregation in public accommodations. It won't change the law, but it changes what our churches stand for officially." "That is good," Friedrich said, though he felt oddly detached from it. The change seemed both too little and too slow, yet also somehow miraculous that it had happened at all. "It wouldn't have happened without you and your companions speaking up. Your testimony carried weight because you had no reason to lie. No stake in our internal arguments. You were just telling what you saw." Friedrich had smiled slightly. "We had every reason to lie. We could have used your divisions against you, could have tried to sow more discord, but it seemed—" he searched for the right word— dishonest. "These soldiers who were turned away, they fought against us. They were our enemies. But they did not deserve that treatment. Even we could see that." "Especially you could see it," Reverend Thomas had corrected, "because you came here expecting one thing and found another. You were looking with fresh eyes." "Perhaps," Friedrich had agreed. "Or perhaps we were simply looking with eyes that had seen what lies produce. We were told many lies, and we believed them. When we saw another lie, that skin color determines worth, we recognized it for what it was." In December of 1945, Friedrich learned he would be repatriated in the spring. Germany was no longer the country he had left, but it was still home, still the place where whatever remained of his family would be, still the place where he would have to build whatever future was possible in the ruins. Before he left, he wrote a letter to Sergeant Robert Johnson. It took him 3 drafts to find the right words. The first draft had been too formal, the second too emotional. The third attempt balanced respect with honesty. Dear Sergeant Johnson, I am returning to Germany in the coming months. I wanted to write to you before I leave. I do not know if this letter will mean anything to you or if you will even wish to read it. We were enemies, and perhaps in some sense we remain enemies. But I want you to know that the day in the diner and the meeting that followed changed something in me. I came to America as a prisoner expecting to find weakness and moral corruption. Instead, I found a nation powerful enough to treat its enemies with dignity, even while it sometimes failed to treat its own citizens with that same dignity. This contradiction troubled me deeply. It still troubles me. I do not know what I will tell people when I return home. I do not know how to explain what I have seen and learned, but I know that when I think of America, I will think of you standing in that church basement, speaking with such control and dignity about injustice you should never have had to endure. I will think of how you thanked me for speaking a truth that should have been obvious to everyone in that room. I hope that your service to your country will someday be recognized as it deserves. I hope that the divisions in your society will heal as the divisions in mine must heal. I hope that the shame I felt in that diner becomes a memory of a time that has passed, not a continuing reality. If we had met in combat, one of us would have tried to end the other's life. Instead, we met in a church basement and tried to speak truth together. I am grateful for the strangeness of that gift. Friedrich Weber. He never knew if the letter reached Sergeant Johnson. He never received a reply, but he kept a copy of it among his few possessions when he finally boarded the ship for home in April of 1946. The Germany he returned to was barely recognizable. Cities reduced to rubble, populations displaced, the entire nation under occupation, and beginning the long process of understanding what had been done in its name. Friedrich returned to his hometown to find his father had survived, but his mother had not, that the farm was gone, that everything familiar had been transformed or destroyed. The physical destruction was terrible, but the moral destruction was worse. As the truth emerged about the camps, about the systematic elimination of populations, about the depths of evil that had been committed, Friedrich and his entire generation had to confront the fact that they had fought for something monstrous. He had believed he was fighting for his country, for his people, for principles he thought were right. Instead, he had been part of a machine that had produced horror on an industrial scale. The propaganda about racial superiority that he had been taught had led not to strength, but to genocide. In the years that followed, as Germany struggled to rebuild, Friedrich spoke rarely of his time as a prisoner. When asked, he would say only that he had been treated well, that the Americans had followed their rules. He did not speak of the diner or the church basement or Sergeant Johnson, but the memory stayed with him. It informed how he thought about justice, about dignity, about the lies nations tell themselves to justify injustice. He became active in reconstruction efforts, working to build a new Germany that would face its past honestly rather than hiding from it. In 1963, watching news coverage of events in Birmingham and Selma, seeing Negro Americans marching for rights, still denied nearly 20 years after the conflict's end, Friedrich remembered that day in the Tennessee diner. He remembered the sergeant's face, the careful control, the dignity maintained in the face of humiliation. He wrote another letter, this time to Reverend Thomas, asking if he had any information about what had become of Sergeant Johnson. 3 months later, he received a reply. Johnson had left the military after the conflict, had attended university on benefits afforded to veterans, had become a teacher. He had marched in Montgomery, he had been arrested in Birmingham, he was still fighting in a different way, the same battle for dignity and recognition. Reverend Thomas included an address. Friedrich wrote to Johnson again, not knowing if the letter would be welcome after so many years. Dear Mr. Johnson, you may not remember me. I was one of the German prisoners at the diner in Tennessee in 1945. I'm writing to you now because I am watching what is happening in your country, and I'm thinking of what you said in that church basement nearly 20 years ago. I returned to Germany and found a nation that had to face the terrible truth of what had been done in our name. We have spent nearly 2 decades trying to understand how we could have believed such lies, how we could have participated in such evil. It has been painful and necessary work. Now I watch your country struggling with its own truths, its own contradictions. I see you and others like you refusing to accept the divisions and injustices that have existed for so long. I want you to know that on that day in the diner, you taught me something important. You taught me that the fight for human dignity never ends, that each generation must choose whether to maintain injustice or challenge it. I chose wrongly in my youth, following leaders who promised strength through division and purity. You have chosen rightly, demanding justice through equality and inclusion. I am an old man now, living in a country still haunted by its past. I have no wisdom to offer except this. What you are doing matters. It matters more than you may know. The shame I felt in that diner has stayed with me all these years. I hope that someday no one will have to feel that shame because such scenes will no longer be possible. Thank you for your service to your country, both in uniform and as a citizen demanding that it live up to its ideals. Friedrich Weber. This time he received a reply. It was brief, but carried the weight of shared experience. Dear Mr. Weber, I remember you and the others who spoke at the church that night. Your words meant more than you knew then, and more than you might know even now. Sometimes the truth needs to come from unexpected voices to be truly heard. Thank you for writing. Thank you for remembering. The struggle continues, but we will prevail because we must. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Robert Johnson. Friedrich kept that letter until his passing in 1987. Among his effects, his children found it along with the copy of his own letter, both preserved carefully in a folder marked simply Tennessee. His daughter, reading through these letters after his funeral, asked her Uncle Klaus, who had remained Friedrich's friend since their time at Camp Forest, what the story behind them was. Klaus, now an old man himself, told her about the diner, about the church basement, about the strange education they had received as prisoners of conflict. He told her about watching American soldiers being turned away while enemy prisoners were served. He told her about the shame and confusion and the slow realization that everything they had been taught about strength and weakness, about superiority and inferiority, had been built on lies. Your father was a good man who lived in terrible times, Klaus said. He made mistakes, as we all did, but he learned from them. That day in the diner taught him something he never forgot, that human dignity matters more than ideology, that divisions based on race or religion or nationality are always lies, and that recognizing injustice is the first step toward opposing it. He paused, looking at the old letters with their careful handwriting and their burden of memory. We went to America as prisoners, expecting to find our enemies. Instead, we found people struggling with the same questions we would later have to struggle with, questions about who deserves dignity, about what makes a nation strong, about whether inherited beliefs should be maintained or challenged. The diner Mabel's closed in 1978. The building was eventually torn down, replaced by a gas station. No historical marker commemorates what happened there in March of 1945. Most of the people who were in that room on that day have passed, taking their memories with them. But the questions raised in that moment remain relevant. How do nations reconcile their ideals with their practices? How do people maintain divisions they know to be unjust, simply because those divisions are familiar? How does change happen? Through laws, through shame, through outside voices speaking uncomfortable truths? Friedrich Weber never claimed to have answers to these questions. He was simply a young man who found himself in a strange situation, who witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew, and who spent the rest of his life trying to live in accordance with what that moment had taught him. The irony he recognized in that Tennessee diner, that he, an enemy prisoner, was treated better than American soldiers who had fought for their country, became a lens through which he viewed all claims of national or racial superiority for the rest of his life. He had learned in the most visceral way possible that the propaganda he had been taught was false. But he had also learned that propaganda exists in many forms, that every nation tells itself comfortable lies, and that sometimes it takes an outsider's eyes to see the contradictions that insiders have learned not to notice. In the end, what happened in that diner mattered not because it changed American law or policy, though the conversations it sparked may have contributed in small ways to larger changes. It mattered because it changed the men who witnessed it, both the prisoners who saw the contradiction and the soldiers who lived it. Those individual transformations, multiplied across thousands of similar moments in countless locations, are how societies eventually evolve beyond the divisions they once considered natural and inevitable. The meal Friedrich could not finish, the shame he could not swallow along with the fried chicken, became a memory that sustained him through decades of difficult questions. When faced with comfortable lies or convenient divisions, he remembered Sergeant Johnson's face and the careful dignity in his voice. He remembered Ernst's simple statement, "This shame is not political, it is human." And that perhaps is the lasting lesson of that March afternoon in rural Tennessee. Shame at injustice is not weakness. It is the beginning of moral clarity. The prisoners who felt shame for being treated better than they deserved, better than men who had fought against them, were feeling something fundamentally human and fundamentally important. That shame was the sound of their own certainties cracking, their own propaganda dissolving, their own capacity for moral reasoning reasserting itself against the lies they had been taught. It was uncomfortable and confusing and deeply unsettling. It was also the first step toward becoming something better than they had been. The room went silent, not because of shock or scandal, but because in that moment everyone present, prisoners and guards, civilians and soldiers, those served and those turned away, recognized a truth too obvious to deny and too uncomfortable to easily accept. The contradiction was undeniable, and once seen, it could not be unseen. What individuals did with that recognition varied. Some, like Friedrich, carried it as a lifelong reminder and measure. Others dismissed it, found ways to rationalize it, returned to comfortable assumptions. But the moment itself remained, a small crack in the edifice of accepted injustice, one of thousands of such cracks that eventually, slowly, led to change. History does not change through single moments or individual revelations. It changes through the accumulation of such moments, through countless individual decisions to see rather than look away, to speak rather than remain silent, to feel shame at injustice rather than accept it as normal. The 7 German prisoners who sat in that diner on March 15, 1945, were not heroes. They were ordinary men, caught in extraordinary circumstances, trying to make sense of a world that had proven far more complicated than anything they had been taught. But in that moment when they could have chosen to ignore what they were seeing, when they could have finished their meals and moved on, they instead allowed themselves to feel the full weight of the contradiction before them. That choice, to feel rather than to dismiss, to question rather than to accept, to speak rather than to remain silent, was not dramatic or revolutionary. It was simply human. But in a world that had been shaped by the choice to dehumanize, to divide, to hate, even small acts of recognizing shared humanity mattered. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.